Welcome to Perspectives. A bunch of 5 uninhabited islands and rocky outcrops in the East China Sea have in recent months captured the world's attention, the source of a bitter territorial dispute between China and Japan. The Japanese have been administering the islands, which they call the Senkaku, for over a century now. China also lays claim to them, calling them the Diaoyu. This September, the slumbering row boiled over when the Japanese government bought the islands from their private Japanese owners. China reacted with fury. Anti-Japanese protests broke out across 85 Chinese cities, bringing bilateral ties to an all-time low. Well, joining me to discuss this, a distinguished panel of leading thinkers from across Asia. First of all, let me start with Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador-at-Large at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies, Mr. Takaki Kojima, former Japanese ambassador to Singapore and Australia, currently visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and Dr. Lamping, a Senior Research Fellow at the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. Welcome to all of you. Now, let's get some clarity on the competing positions here. We know that Japan insists that there is no dispute, and of course the Chinese are now calling the islands a core interest, a term which they've applied to Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan. Victor Gao, if I may start with you. Why was the Japanese government wrong in purchasing the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands?
Well, the Diaoyu Island dispute between China and Japan dated all the way back to 1895, when there was a war at that time between China and Japan. From the Chinese perspective, that's a war of aggression, because at that time Japan was an imperialistic power, colonizing towards the end of the 19th century. And in between the war, almost towards the end of the war, Japan occupied Diaoyu Island, claiming that the island was not inhabited. Now, that was the beginning of the dispute. Ever since then, the dispute has been going on. And if you check the record, even after the Second World War, the United States, which for a while took custody of the island, never claimed that either the Americans have the sovereignty over the island, or when they handed over the administrative right of the islands to Japan, the United States even today does not say that Japan has the sovereignty. So the dispute is there, and I think by 1895, to claiming by Japan that the islands was uninhabited was completely false. So I think the dispute should be recognized, and China and Japan should come back to the negotiation table and try to find a peaceful way out of this dispute.
Right. Takaki, if I can bring you into this conversation, I mean, do the Chinese really have a claim? Victor Gao is, of course, saying that the islands were not free for the taking in 1895.
I hope I can sort of say expand the position of the Japanese side. And well before 1895, Japan had investigated whether this group of islands are so-called terra nullius, the no man's land. And after careful study, we decided this must be the terra nullius. So in 1895, before the Sino-Japanese War, we formally incorporated into Okinawa Prefecture. So what Victor said is it's not saying that it's because of the Sino-Japanese War we took the Senkaku Islands, including Taiwan, from China, but that's not the case.
But
first of all.
Yeah.
And secondly, you got to the second point. After the Second World War, Japan renounced Taiwan. And formally in 1951 by so-called San Francisco Peace Treaty. But prior to that, China had already incorporated Taiwan into its territory after the Second World War. Japan was defeated. China was one of the allied powers. While the Senkaku Islands, which belonged to Okinawa, were placed under U.S. administration. And in this period, neither Beijing nor Taipei did claim the Senkaku Islands as part of Taiwan or as part of China.
That is a fact, though, Victor, isn't it? That China has never protested Japanese ownership claims until 1970.
Now the 70s.
No, this is completely
until
false.
1970, when it was believed that there was natural gas, maybe oil, maybe minerals under the seabed surrounding the rocks that China and maybe even Taiwan emerged to say, hey, this is ours.
No, this is false. No, between Taiwan and mainland China, there is no dispute. We are all in the Chinese family. So anyone claiming that mainland China or Taiwan have different claims on Diaoyu Island, that's false, because we are all standing for the Chinese sovereignty over Diaoyu Island. That's number one. Number two is that even though the focus right now is on Diaoyu Island, I think it actually reveals a more profound and more dangerous situation. That is, I'm afraid that Japan has failed to come to terms of its complete defeat and unconditional surrender at the end of the Second World War, very differently from the Germany's case. Now, in 1943, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom signed the Cairo Declaration, in which three countries united as allied powers to commit to drive Japan out of all the occupied territories that it took either by greed or by imperialistic expansion. Now, in 1945, the Allied countries signed the Potsdam Declaration, once again committing the Allies to unconditional defeat of Japan. Therefore, in both these declarations, China was a party. China was very much involved in the Second World War as one of the Allied countries. China had many years of wars of resistance against Japanese aggression, and China made a huge contribution to the defeat of Japan at the end of the Second World War. I think the problem is that in Japan, unlike the Germany's case, it is fashionable and it is politically convenient, or it is even considered as politically correct for politicians to go to Yakushuni Shrine, for example, which still houses,
maybe maybe we go to the shrine. Maybe
Later.
Allow Pengge and I.
Yes, I would like to...
Two friends of both China and Japan, but neutral on the competing claims, to say something. And what I'd like to say is that there are two competing narratives about who has sovereignty over Senkaku Diaoyu. The Chinese narrative is that it's always been part of China. It's always been appurtenant to Taiwan. It was ceded to Japan as a result of the war in 1895, and under the treaty, the Shimonoseki Treaty. All these territories that were ceded to Japan under the unequal treaty should be returned to China. And Japan hasn't done that. So this is the Chinese narrative. You had sovereignty, you were defeated in a war, you ceded the territory to Japan, and Japan should return the territory to you. The Japanese narrative is a different narrative. The Japanese narrative is that these islands were terra nullius. They belonged to no one. And Japan had done surveys. They were ruled from Okinawa, the ancient kingdom of Kyushu. And they were not covered by the 1895 treaty. I mean, so there are two competing narratives about sovereignty. The point I want to make to both is that, for 40 years, from 1972 until now, the two countries agreed to put aside all these sovereignty disputes, to cooperate with each other in their mutual interest. And as for the disputed territory, to say there should be no building or installation, there should be no visit, and we should avoid provoking each other. So my appeal to both Takaaki and to Victor is, instead of quarreling over who's right and who's wrong, and we can't decide this unless the two of you will take the dispute to a court of law and let the court of law settle it, why don't we come back to the status quo ante? Of managing this dispute.
Can I bring Pengge in, actually? Because, I mean, obviously this dispute has been slumbering for many decades now. The question is, why has it become so fraught all of a sudden? I mean, are we looking at really growing nationalism on the part of both China and Japan, which is, basically aggravating this threat?
Yeah. Before I address the question about resurgent nationalism, let us seek truth from facts. The fact is, this territorial dispute have waxed and waned. In 1972, when both countries established official ties, it was pretty much swept under the carpet. Both countries had a common enemy, the Soviet Union. 1978, both countries established a friendship treaty. And again, the territorial issue was shelved to the future generation, to the next generation. It was not a big issue between both sides. I think what's different between 1972, 1978 and today is the fact that in the 1970s, both China and Japan had strong political leadership. Today, on both sides of the East China Sea, we see relatively weak political leaders in transition. Back in 1972, when Mao and Zhou Enlai decided to defer the issue, what was important in China then was for Tokyo to cut its ties with Taipei, to recognize Beijing instead of Taipei, and to forge a united front against the Soviet Union. That was the priority, that was the main contradiction which Beijing was trying to address, not the territorial dispute. So in 1972 and also in 1978, 78 was the paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, who said that, okay, let's defer it to the next generation. Who is going to criticize them? Who would criticize Mao or Deng Xiaoping?
Let's hold that thought, because we have to go for break right now. We've got to go for a short break. So, Pinger's point that weak leadership is basically bringing about the current scenario, the fact that they're taking tough stands against each other. Keep that thought. We'll come back to you in a while. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, let's pick up on what Pinger was saying earlier, that, nationalism is really rearing its head on both sides, China and Japan. Let's go to Takaki.
Okay.
Would you agree that that's what we're witnessing here, that, we're seeing a more nationalistic Japan?
Well, before commenting on that, coming back to the Senkaku Island issue and commenting on the Victor's comment, the one thing that China did not challenge after the defeat of Japan, and China incorporated Taiwan back to China after the Second World War. And in the article on January 8, 1953, it says that defines that Senkaku Islands are part of Ryukyu Islands, and it called the islands by the Japanese names of Senkaku. And they produced maps during that period.
So, Victor, China did not challenge the ownership after World War II.
Absolutely false.
Why?
Couple of points. Let me make a couple of points. For Japan to claim in 1895 that Diaoyu Islands were uninhabited was the equivalent as if Japan claimed that they had justification to bomb Pearl Harbor. Now, how could the islands be uninhabited in 1895 when China had records dating back for hundreds of years, and the Chinese fishermen using Diaoyu Islands for their fishing purposes, for their navigation purposes, etc. Now, after the Second World War, I think it's very unfortunate that Japan still indulges in a lot of fantasies and distortions of truth. Now, they have the habit of very partially selective memories. And, for example, if they say, okay, at 5 o'clock p.m. the sun is in the west, and that's the equivalent to that sun rises in the west, that's the falsehood that Japan still indulges in.
Well,
now, the selection of the articles,
very tricky here. I mean,
the
historicity
is
and
not
the
the
legality of the islands, is very complex. And there are two different timelines here.
In 1951,
for both China and Japan. The question now is, I think, what we'd like to raise is that why has this actually come to a head in recent months? Why has that happened?
Before we answer the question, why? Maybe we'll let Victor finish. And then
let me finish, yes.
Let me propose something as a way forward.
Yes.
Yeah? Please.
Yeah. In 1951, when Japan and the United States signed the San Francisco Treaty, the Chinese Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, strongly protested against the fact that they were ceding control over Diaoyu Island, over which China had sovereignty, between one party which didn't have the sovereignty to the other party which also didn't have the sovereignty.
But didn't Zhou Enlai also say, you know, that he wanted to shelve the dispute? Did he not also say that?
In the 1970s.
Yes, leave it to the next generation.
But that's different.
That's very different. He mentioned to the Japanese visitors, the Prime Minister, etc., and later the Japanese leaders, that China and Japan might not be able to solve the Diaoyu Island dispute at that time. And he thought, if we did not have enough wisdom during our generation, let's leave it to the future generations. And he believed that the Chinese nation and the Japanese nation would have enough wisdom to resolve this in a peaceful manner. So do we have
the wisdom today? Do both sides actually have the wisdom today to solve this, Prof. Ko?
Well, I'm going to suggest to both my good friend Takaki and to Victor that let us try to manage this dispute and contain it and not allow it to spill over, which is happening now. To Takaki, I would say, why is Japan not willing to acknowledge that there is a dispute with China over Senkaku Diaoyu? And secondly, to both of you, if both of you are so convinced that your case is the right one,
go to ICJ.
Why are you not willing to refer this dispute to either international arbitration or international adjudication?
That's a very good point. You know? Okay, let me put it to Victor and both Takaki. I mean, would you put this to the ICJ?
First,
Let's start with you,
Takaki.
Yeah. Would you acknowledge the dispute and put this to the ICJ?
Personally, I think that the suggestion by Ms. Tommy merits, which Japan and China should consider. And although the Japanese government denies the existence of territorial dispute itself, however, they acknowledge that there is diplomatic disputes over this island. And but as far as I'm concerned, I don't see any initiative from the Chinese side to initiate action to bring the case to international court. Because Japan is in possession of Senkaku Islands and convinced that this belongs to Japan.
Yes. So would the Chinese take this to the International Court of Justice?
Let me hold your horses and let me say a few words about this. Prime Minister Noda at the United Nations argued that Japan is a country which respects international law, and Tokyo advocates the settlement of international disputes by international law. And apparently he's going to make the same pitch at the forthcoming ASEM meeting in Laos. So to be consistent, if the Prime Minister of Japan means what he says, and he says what he means, then Japan should be open to the possibilities of China or any other countries. It has territorial disputes with Taiwan, South Korea, Russia. Refer to the International Court of ICJ,
so Victor,
international law.
Yeah, if the Japanese are willing to change their conventional position, right, that basically there is a dispute over the sovereignty, would the Chinese be open to that?
First of all, the Chinese request and position is a very simple one. That is, Japan should acknowledge there is a dispute about the sovereignty over Diaoyu Island.
So if they acknowledge that there is a dispute, would the Chinese pick up?
And then Japan need to come back to the negotiation table. That's number one. Now, if the Japanese Prime Minister Noda is serious about respecting the international law, then he need to read Cairo Declaration, which was the basis of the defeat of Japanese in the Second World War, and he need to respect Potsdam Declaration. Now, if any defeated Axis countries disregard the foundation upon which they were defeated and surrendered unconditionally, this is a challenge of the post-war international order. And the international community will not allow that, and I think Japan needs to witness and face the consequences of challenging the international security order, which is based on the complete defeat and unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and imperialistic Japan.
I'd like to interrupt Victor. I'd like to interrupt Victor and say that by your answer, by your long answer, I think the short answer is you want to bring the dispute back to the negotiating table, but not to a court of law. Not to a court of law.
ICJ.
Not to ICJ.
So Japan does not acknowledge there is a dispute.
No, but we are saying
and Japan claims that it respects international law while they want to challenge the Cairo Declaration.
No, but you're
and
not
the
answering the question.
No, but
you're not answering the question.
If Japan does come back to
acknowledges
the
that there is
negotiating
Japan need to
table
come
and
back to the-
acknowledges that there is a dispute,
And
would
also
that
they need to
placate
read
China?
Cairo Declaration.
I think
and
that-
the
If they
Boston
read
Declaration.
if they read
You're
all
not
that,
answering
and
the
they,
question.
yes, I
So
mean,
may I suggest to both Victor and Takaki that if going to a court of law is not an option, and we must respect that some countries choose not to refer their disputes to courts of law, then can I suggest to the two of you that there's another option which you should seriously explore, which is something that Deng Xiaoping proposed back in '78, joint development. Put aside the dispute on sovereignty. Why is it not possible for these two great countries, China and Japan, to say, let us allow fishermen from both sides to fish in the adjacent waters of the 5 rocks? Why is it
Pino,
not
what do you
possible?
think? I mean, is that possible in this? I mean, is that realistic
why is
in
it
this
not
day and age? I mean, we're looking at two governments which
it's
are
very reasonable.
yes.
But I think it's a little too idealistic
Yes.
because
It's
the
not
domestic politics of China and Japan
I think
has changed. The domestic atmosphere is really bad. In the case of China, since 1989, since the Tiananmen incident, the national government had emphasized patriotic education. And it's very, very difficult for the national government to back down on Senkaku
sorry.
Diaoyu Islands.
I'm not
That's one
asking.
thing.
I'm not
Yes.
asking anybody to back down. I'm just saying.
I think
And,
I think
and then
Ambassador
domestic
Ko's-
politics, you find that the guy who's going to likely to be the next prime minister of Japan is known to be relatively hawkish. Abe, who said that he regretted not visiting Yasukuni Shrine when he was the prime minister of Japan. Right. And his coalition partner may well be the mayor of Osaka.
So
Hashimoto
yes.
Toga.
So we're looking at two countries. We're looking at two countries,
Why don't you
gentlemen.
let Victor answer my question?
Well, is that the
No,
case?
I think Ambassador Ko has
All right.
all the wisdom.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, the position he outlined just now has been the Chinese position for a couple of decades already. China's position has always been keep the status quo without flaring up and without, confronting with each other over the sovereignty issue. But let's do the development first. China and Japan, or China or Philippines, or China, Vietnam can develop the resources together.
It is a fact that sentiment is flaring up.
No.
I mean, we are seeing protests across 85 Chinese cities.
Yes.
Things are not
Why?
good.
You need to ask
Takaki,
them why.
please.
That's because
Yes.
of the nationalization effort by the Japanese government.
Nationalization effort by the Japanese government.
It's the Japanese
Takaki.
side which disturbed the status quo. For more than 1 century and a half, we administered and exercised control over Senkaku Islands peacefully. It's China challenging this status quo. It's not Japan.
I think.
So is China really coming across as an irrational bully
No,
now? I mean, you didn't make
no.
any claims
Listen,
for over
I
a
think-
century, and
Even
right now, you
with-
are making
with-
those claims because maybe China can.
With due
that's the
respect,
perception. Yeah.
with due respect to Ambassador Kojima-san, I think his position basically ignored the fact that Japan was a country of aggression in the Second World War and before. And Japan was completely defeated and unconditionally surrendered. To call Japan peacefully administered Diaoyu Island before the end of the Second War was completely false because Japan was a country of occupying force
We don't
and
expect
colonizing.
we don't expect Victor and Takaki to agree. Yeah, there are two different narratives. No point going there. We will never agree on which is the correct narrative. My interest is to bring about peace between China and Japan. My interest, and I'm worried about the rising nationalism in both Japan and China. And I'm worried that, after 1972, economic relations between China and Japan have blossomed, So the high-level anti-Japanese feeling among the Chinese people is jeopardizing the good economic relation between the two countries.
All right.
And this is not good for you, it's not good for Japan.
All right, hold
it's
that
not good
thought.
for us in Southeast Asia.
Yes, hold
because
that
our
thought.
economies
Absolutely
are interconnected,
Absolutely
Yes,
not.
And-
hold that thought. We need to take another break now. Is nationalism jeopardizing, as Tomiko says, the economic ties between two of Asia's best and biggest economies? Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. We're talking China-Japan relations and how the disputed islands are putting that relationship to the test. I want to pick up with what Tommy Ko was saying. Basically, that economic interest between the two have been very strong. Do you think that economic interest will help to keep the peace?
Partly because of this, the deterioration of Japan-China relationship. Toyota, Nissan, and Honda had to reduce the amount of sales and the production in China. So it is affecting Japan, but at the same time it is affecting China as well. So but we have to overcome this situation.
Do the Chinese feel that? I mean, the fact that this could all sort of backfire on the Chinese. I mean, the Japanese are already thinking of putting their investments elsewhere outside of China.
First of all, the recent escalation was caused by the nationalization done by the Japanese government over the Diaoyu Island, and the protests in China and the angry denunciation of the nationalization initiative by the Chinese government were fully justified in this context. Now, China and Japan now are the second and the third largest economies in the world. So both countries have all the interest to deal with each other with high responsibility, and a lot of soberness rather than, a jump for the gun. However, when the sovereignty issue is being pushed to the corner, then the Chinese people will not allow. How can any Chinese person in his right mind tolerate the nationalization of Diaoyu Island? So I think the Chinese government will need to do whatever that is necessary. If Japan wants to instigate a war over Diaoyu Island, then China will be fully prepared to deal with Japan.
I mean, is Japan trying to provoke a war? I mean, will both sides actually come to war because of these islands? No, Takaki, you go first. Yes.
Victor talked about the national relation by the Japanese side, but actually from the beginning, these islands were owned by the state government. And during the course, a few islands were leased, then sold to private citizens. But the government retained some of the islands from the beginning to the end. That's one thing. Second, we should allow the freedom of expression or demonstration. But we are witnessing some vandalism against Japanese nationals or factories or shops in Beijing or Shanghai and other parts of the world. So these, so to say, factories or Japanese nationals have nothing to do with the territorial disputes as such. So vandalism should not be allowed.
I think that you raise the specter of war. You shouldn't have.
If Japan wants to instigate a war.
No, but the last thing Japan wants to do is instigate. I mean, nobody wants a war, No I mean, a war between China and Japan is first irrational. To fight over 5 useless rocks, it's totally irrational. Given how much common interest the two of you have, to fight over 5 rocks of dubious utility is irrational.
No, conflict had both sides.
But hold on.
It's absolutely irrational to nationalize the ownership of the island by Japan.
But Victor, have the Chinese leadership explained to the public that Prime Minister Noda's action in nationalizing these rocks was a preemptive move?
If you believe that, then you need to believe that Japan had the justification to bomb Pearl Harbor.
No. I mean, that's a fast-patch analogy.
I think this is an act of infamy to claim that because of domestic pressure, the Japanese central government is nationalizing the ownership of Diaoyu Island. If you believe that, you forget the infamy in which Japan committed all these war crimes.
Yeah, but you're making unnecessary, irrelevant.
Can I put this question to Mr. Takaki?
Before you do that, I want to nail down my point, which is that, and then I'm a neutral between this dispute. But as a neutral observer, I think Prime Minister Noda had no choice but to nationalize the rocks in order to prevent the former governor of Tokyo, Shintaro Ishihara, from purchasing 2 or 3 of the rocks from a private party who have ownership of them. So the only way he can preempt the former governor of Tokyo from buying this island is to say, no, you can't buy them, and to tell the seller you can't sell them to the city of Tokyo because they belong to the nation,
Can I put this out there? Tommy? I mean, whether or not the municipal government bought it or whether the central government bought it, I mean, surely the Japanese knew that by purchasing the island, that would be quite provocative.
I mean, but the governor of the former governor of Tokyo is a well-known hawk. I mean, he's anti-China. You know, his attitude toward China is unfriendly.
Ambassador Ko, I think the fact that Japan would tolerate the former mayor of Tokyo to resort to such extreme positions is exactly indicative of the dangerous situation in Japan. That is why I mentioned Japan has failed to come to terms of its unconditional surrender in the Second War. Japan, compared with Germany, is far away from what Germany has achieved.
But this was a preemptive move.
This is dangerous for people in this part of the world who suffered from the Japanese aggression in the Second World War.
So, but Victor, would you concede that this was a preemptive move on the part of the central government to prevent the islands from going into a right-wing party?
Absolutely not.
Okay, Ping absolutely
hold
not,
your
yes.
horses. Let me say a few things. There are at least two interpretations. On the part of the Japanese, the purchase by the central government is a lesser evil because Governor Ishihara announced that he will plan to build a harbor for Japanese fishermen, and perhaps other facilities too. That would definitely infuriate and antagonize the Chinese. But some of my Chinese friends mentioned that the nationalization, to them, doesn't matter whether it's Ishihara or Noda, the outcome is the same. The outcome is nationalization. You know, to them, it's like, is there some kind of conspiracy, a good cop, bad cop routine, okay? But let's set this aside. The fact is, the Prime Minister of Japan today, Prime Minister Noda, was relatively weak. His ruling party is likely to lose the next general election. And he has to think, you know, if he does not take a strong stance, his DPJ party will be further decimated at the polls. So weak political leadership.
Okay.
You have a strong political leader, strong prime minister. He would have put
Would
Governor
you agree,
Ishihara in place.
Takaki, that basically the current prime minister is really put in a position where he has to fight for his country's corner because things are not so rosy at home?
Anyway,
I mean, there's a stagnating economy. People are not happy. He can't appear to be soft on the issue.
Anyway, whoever in power, Japanese prime minister must retain the sovereign integrity, sovereign right. Sovereign territorial, right and sovereignty over, even for a small group of islands. That's the position of any government who will become prime minister.
Sure, but by buying the islands, I mean, that is widely criticized and interpreted as the government pandering to the rising nationalism in Japan.
It's a matter of transferring the ownership.
Yeah, but it's changing the status quo.
I think the status quo is now changed. We already crossed that threshold.
Yeah, so no point.
China will
Rubicon
no
has been
longer
crossed.
allow Japan to exercise control of the island. That's why, for many days in a row, the Chinese marine surveillance ships are already operating within the 12 miles of Diaoyu Island, and the Chinese ships are ordering the Japanese ships to leave. And I think such activities will continue until we achieve the goal that Japan need to come back to the negotiation table.
That's a very dangerous game. Both are playing chicken with each other. My
China will not blink first.
Is that there might well be an accidental
China will
collision
not blink first
between the Japan Coast Guard and Chinese fishing boats, or is it inconceivable that the Chinese maritime oceanic craft may collide with the Japan Coast Guard vessel, and
collision already happened.
Ships are sunk, and then lives are lost. And if lives are lost, then what happens?
So let me put this out there. Do you think that Japan is in a position, or the Japanese leadership is in a position to rescind this purchase? Will the Japanese rescind the purchase?
No, it will not happen.
That will not happen.
Let me raise a different issue. You keep referring to Germany.
Yes.
Yeah? Since you keep referring to Germany, let me ask the two of you this. When the Nobel Prize Committee announced that the winner of this year's Peace Prize is the European Union, I applauded that.
It's a good decision.
Many people did not, because many people did not know that it was the founding of the European Union in the beginning as a European Economic Community, which laid the groundwork for European integration and for the maintenance of peace in Europe since the end of the Second World War, 1945. So my question to you, Victor, and to Takaaki is, 67 years have passed since the end of the Second World War. When will there be a closure When will there be a historic conciliation between China and Japan?
Ambassador, you say the right thing. I think the Nobel Peace Prize Committee this year did the right thing to award the Peace Prize to EU. However, may I remind you that the fact that EU was formed was actually based on the fact that Germany completely renounced its Nazi tradition. And Germany, in the post-Second World War era, completely broke away from Nazism. That's the foundation where France and Germany could form the alliance with each other, and that's the basis on which Germany was allowed into NATO. And this is the basis why Germany has been able to exercise leadership not only in Europe but also in the world.
All right. I think we have to interrupt. So, I'm sorry, gentlemen. You've got to hold your horses and keep that thought in your head. We've got to go for a break right now. The question now is, can China and Japan put this behind them, their wartime past? Stay with us. Okay, thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. We're back and we're talking China-Japan relations. We're in the fourth part of our program, of course. We were talking about basically how the feuding that is going on right now and what we're witnessing is really a vestige of the wartime past between both sides. The fact that there's a lot of wartime baggage that hasn't been dealt with. How are we going to throw this off? I mean, we've got apologies that have not sufficed. We've had textbooks which paper over atrocities. We've got very, very unresolved issues here. What's going to give?
I think Victor's point is that in the case of Germany, there was a complete break from its Nazi past. The post-war German leaders were completely open and repentant about all the evils that the Nazi Germany perpetrated on their neighbors and against others. But I would say to Victor that in the same way, since the end of the Second World War, you have a new Japan. It's a democratic Japan. It's a peaceful Japan. It's a Japan which has been enormously helpful to the development of its neighbors, including China. You know? So I think you should acknowledge that.
At the same time, I would like to remind you that during the course of 1990s, Prime Minister Murayama did express the fundamental remorse about the past. And in the views of most of the Japanese, I think they are feeling some apology fatigue, so to say. Any apology, whatever repeated, will not be accepted by China. That's the case for Chiang Kai-shek's visit in 1998. He repeated to claim that the apology must be again made. And at the same time, I'd like to mention this point. It's a pity at the beginning of the normalization in 1972, as Victor agreed, that we had a good start. Mm-hmm. The perception of Japanese people against the Chinese is so good. 80% felt the Chinese are good friends and so on and so forth. At the moment, reverse, 80%. Against. And what I'm not blaming totally on China, but at the same time, in the 1990s, partly after Deng Xiaoping, the new leaders of China in 1990s tried to legitimize the Communist Party rule by introducing history education.
Yes.
By meaning education through history means to show up the role of Communist Party against so-called Japanese aggressors.
Yeah, that goes back to Pinger's point. That basically, there was this collective, sort of education of the Chinese people.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the point I'd like to make. Because of that, if we compare the, so to say, feeling of the Chinese people, younger people are more anti-Japanese compared to older generation.
So, Pinger, what do you think? Do you think that both countries can roll back these nationalist feelings and sentiments which they've been nurturing through the decades since the war ended?
I think very, very difficult to turn back the clock. But then I think we can remind ourselves that things were really pretty good. Just barely, 5 years ago, when then Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo visited the birthplace of Confucius, and he wrote in his beautiful Chinese characters, kanji, saying, revering the past, fulfilling the future. And the Chinese can understand his Chinese characters, the Japanese characters. President Hu Jintao reciprocated by visiting Nara, which is a miniature Chang'an.
Yes, but all these overtures always fall by the wayside, don't they? I mean, all the positive overtures on both sides to each other, I mean, they fall away very quickly when something erupts.
No, if you allow me to make one point, I think among the Chinese people, there is high respect for the Japanese people on a person-to-person or people-to-people level. After all, genetically speaking, the Chinese and the Japanese probably are very close anyway, if not cousins with each other.
We are also very close to the chimpanzees.
And also, Japan is the only major country in the world which still uses kanji outside of China. That means, you know, even though in the post-Second World War era, China and Japan have embarked upon completely different paths of development, but now both Japan and China have become among the top 3 economies in the world. That explained, you know, something between China and Japan, and it actually explains some common lineage or common cultural heritage. Whenever I go to Japan, I do not feel alien. I feel actually very much partially at home.
Well, that's all very good on a personal level, but on the political level, that doesn't figure.
That means on the macro level, I'm confident about China-Japan relations. However, the problem is not between the Chinese nation versus the Japanese nation. The problem is about this kind of a dangerous rearmament or the militarization of Japan, which is a dangerous trend. Now, Japan sometimes wants to bring the United States into this dispute between China and Japan on the Diaoyu Island. That will be a very dangerous trend because we are talking about the top 3 largest economies of the world. The United States, China, and Japan may eventually do something which will get out of control over Diaoyu Island.
That will be very, very dangerous. China is outspending Japan as far as military expenditure is concerned. Japan has kept it flat at 1% GDP.
To what extent,
you may be reminded that Chinese population is about 10 times bigger than Japan. And Chinese territory is about
But to what extent, Pinga, would you say that this dispute is also a focal point of Sino-American competition in the region? After all, we know that, you know, the U.S. Is bound by the security arrangements to be protecting Japan post-war, and that's going to come into play.
I don't buy that. I don't think the Americans are stirring up trouble. The Americans want to avoid conflict between China and Japan.
The U.S. doesn't want to be dragged in.
Why? Because if there's war between China and Japan, the United States will get involved because Japan is a treaty ally of the United States. So I think let's put United States on the side for once. Let me directly address Victor and Takaki. And I remind you of what Deng Xiaoping said in 1978. The 2 countries have a 2,000-year relationship. 2,000 years. Except for a few moments in history. 1895, 1937 to 1945. The 2 countries and the 2 peoples were great friends. You know? And I would say it is not beyond the realm of possibility for these 2 great nations to again reconcile and construct mutually beneficial relationships.
Absolutely.
Right.
And both sides should avoid brinksmanship in the East China Sea.
Okay, gentlemen, we really have only 2 minutes, so I would really like to get a quick last word from all of you. I mean, are both sides, both China and Japan, are they willing to go to war over this? Is it going to come to that?
Absolutely.
Pinga, starting from you.
I don't think so. Too much is at stake. Because a war will impact negatively not only on China and Japan, but the whole region. I think it has to be avoided at all costs. I think both sides will have to agree to disagree, and to avoid any armed conflict or even accidental conflict or coalition in the East China Sea.
Mr. Kojima.
Well, I agree with Ian. And at the same time, I must remind you that in 1974 and 1995, China took the part of Paracel Island and Spratly Island by force. And we should avoid that sort of situation.
All right, Tommy.
Yeah. My view is that there will be no war between China and Japan. I also think that it is not inevitable that there should be constant tension between these two great nations. But if they have a historical perspective, if they know what the fundamental interests are, it is in both your interests to have good relations with each other. And I think 67 years after 1945, the time has come to bring closure to the past.
Has the time come to bring closure to the past, Victor?
No, I'm confident that this part of the world will continue to enjoy peace and stability and prosperity. However, that should be based on the complete respect of the post-Second World War international order, and it should not tolerate anyone to challenge the international security order as a result which was based on the victory legacies of the Second World War. Now, therefore, based on that, I truly believe that we can, ensure that the friendship between China and Japan can be sustainable and people in this part of the world will enjoy prosperity.
Thank you very much. We have to end it there, I'm afraid. The historicity and the legality of the islands, we know, are complex issues that cannot be solved overnight, and certainly they're not going to be solved here at this table today. So thank you all very much for coming and joining us here on this panel. Every time an island row flares up, attitudes harden and trust erodes, but let's hope it's just that. I'd like to thank my panel. Thank you, Professor Tommy Ko, Takaki Kojima, Victor Gao, and Dr. Lam Ping-er. 2012 marks 40 years since the normalization of Sino-Japanese ties, but the year has been marred by hostilities, protests, and military brinksmanship. Stark reminders that China and Japan are still weighed down by historical baggage. Now that China has emerged as the region's dominant power, can the two Asian giants hammer out a new dynamic? We hope you found our discussion thought-provoking. Do help us shape the next episode of Perspectives. You can write or connect with us by leaving your comments on our website, and you can tweet us as well. I'm Lian Peg. Till our next edition of Perspectives. Thanks for watching.